The wind over the Nile carried secrets of gods and kings, and among them, a woman who would change everything. Her name was Cleopatra, a queen born not just to rule, but to fight destiny itself. When empires clashed and men wrote the laws of power, she dared to write her own. Her crown wasn't made of gold, it was made of courage. Her beauty wasn't her weapon, her mind was. While others bowed to tradition, she stood tall against it, unshaken and unafraid. In a world where women were told to obey, she learned to command. She spoke the language of kings, scholars, and soldiers. 7 tongues, but one voice of fire. Her story began in marble palaces and burning deserts, a tale of survival, love, betrayal, and empire. From the shadows of Alexandria to the heart of Rome, she faced the rise and fall of worlds. Every loss shaped her strength. Every scar whispered, "Power is not given, it is taken." Cleopatra was not a dreamer. She was a storm that refused to fade. And though centuries have passed, her spirit still burns. Because legends never die, they become mirrors. Mirrors that remind us what we are capable of. What it means to stand when the world wants you to kneel. This is not just history. It is a lesson about power, faith, and the fire that never dies. So listen closely, because this is the story of the queen who refused to fall. The sun rose over Alexandria, painting the palace walls in gold. Inside, a cry echoed. A queen was born. Her name was Cleopatra, daughter of power and prophecy. She arrived not into peace, but into chaos. The world around her trembled between empires and ambition. Even as a child, she could feel the weight of destiny. Her father, King Lysis, ruled with trembling hands. His throne rested on coins, not loyalty. The nobles whispered behind marble pillars. They saw weakness and smelled opportunity. But Cleopatra, even as a girl, watched and remembered. She learned early that silence could be a weapon. While others fought for attention, she listened. While others spoke, she understood. Her tutors taught her Greek, Latin, and Egyptian. But life taught her something greater: survival. At night, she read scrolls under candlelight. Stories of gods, of stars, of rulers who rose and fell. She wasn't born to be a shadow. She was born to be a flame. Every word she learned sharpened her like a sword. Every doubt from others became her fuel. She mastered politics before most girls learned to dance. She studied the heart of power, not just its crown. The palace was her battlefield. Soft smiles, sharp lies. Every servant, every guard, every glance meant something. Her father trusted no one, not even his blood. So Cleopatra trusted only herself. Behind her calm eyes, storms of thought moved. She saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. When her mother vanished one cold evening, Cleopatra did not cry. She learned. She learned that love in a palace was fragile. That loyalty had a price. But still, she dreamed, not of jewels or thrones, but of freedom. She wanted to rule not by fear, but by wisdom. Not to be remembered as royal, but as rightful. The priests spoke of the gods' will. Cleopatra began to believe in her own. As years passed, the child became a woman. Her mind grew sharper, her voice stronger. She walked through marble halls like one born to command. Every step carried quiet authority. Those who once dismissed her now looked twice. They saw not a girl, but a queen in waiting. She learned to charm without surrendering power, to smile while her mind calculated every word. The servants whispered her name with respect. The scholars bowed a little lower when she entered. And yet, she never forgot the lessons of her youth, that empires fall when rulers stop listening. Cleopatra listened to the people, to the silence, to the truth. She knew Egypt's heart better than any map could show. Though her blood was Greek, her soul was Egyptian. She spoke to farmers, priests, soldiers, and they followed. They saw in her eyes the promise of renewal, a queen who would not rule from distance, but from understanding. Her destiny was no longer written by others. It was forged in every decision she made. And as the night fell over the palace once more, she stood by her window, staring at the moon. The river below shimmered like a path of silver. She whispered softly, "My time will come." For deep within her heart, Cleopatra already knew she was meant to lead. Not tomorrow, not someday, but soon. And when that day came, the world would remember her name. Because from the moment she breathed her first, the universe had already chosen her path. To rise against doubt, to defy fear, to become the legend the world would never forget, the queen who refused to fall. The palace glittered with gold, but behind its beauty, darkness waited. Cleopatra walked through corridors lined with marble and whispers. Every smile hid a secret, every shadow hid a blade. Her father, King Lysis, feared betrayal more than death. He trusted no one, not even his own blood. At the royal feasts, laughter filled the halls. But beneath the music, tension coiled like a serpent. Cleopatra learned to read danger in silence. She could sense deceit before a word was spoken. Her brother, Prince Theon, grew jealous of her intellect. He called her proud. She called him unready. Servants carried rumors like gifts. Advisors plotted as they poured wine. One wrong glance could cost a life. One careless word could end a dynasty. Cleopatra's mother was gone, her presence replaced by rumors and ghosts. Some said she fled. Others whispered she was silenced. Cleopatra never found the truth. But she understood one thing: trust was a luxury. She spent nights in the library instead of the ballroom. Books were safer companions than courtiers. There, among the scent of papyrus and ink, she built her sanctuary of thought. She studied how rulers lost kingdoms, and how some saved them with their minds alone. While other royals sought pleasure, Cleopatra sought purpose. The priests said power came from the gods. She believed power came from knowledge. She listened to the cries of the people outside the palace gates. Farmers, traders, mothers, their struggles became her lessons. She began to see the cracks in her father's rule. Gold could not hide the suffering beneath it. Egypt, rich in culture and spirit, was drowning under foreign debts and fear. And though she was young, Cleopatra carried that pain as her own. Each day she learned to wear her mask better, to smile while calculating her next move. Her enemies underestimated her silence. They mistook grace for weakness. But silence, for Cleopatra, was preparation. Every quiet hour was a sharpening blade. At 14, she stood before the royal mirror. The girl she saw no longer looked like a child. Her eyes carried storms. Her voice carried steel. She knew she would need both. The palace was not her home anymore. It was her battlefield. Each ally was uncertain. Each step could lead to ruin. But she walked forward, calm, deliberate, unafraid. Because fear, once mastered, becomes strength. And Cleopatra had learned to master it well. One evening, as torches flickered in the dark halls, a voice whispered from behind a curtain, "You will never rule." Cleopatra turned, smiled softly, and said, "Then watch me." That night, the moonlight fell across her face, and for the first time, she felt truly alone. But in that solitude, something awakened, a silent promise to herself. No matter how deep the shadows, she would rise brighter than the dawn, because within the palace of deceit and fear, a queen was being born, and her light, once unleashed, would change the world forever. The seasons turned, and Cleopatra grew. The girl of shadows became a woman of purpose. Her beauty began to draw attention. But her mind, that was her true weapon. While others learned to charm, she learned to rule. While others practiced smiles, she practiced silence. Each morning, she read scrolls on law, science, and strategy. Each night, she wrote notes about human behavior. She understood that power was not just a throne. It was the ability to understand hearts. Cleopatra spoke to scholars and soldiers alike. She listened more than she spoke. Her questions pierced deeper than flattery ever could. People felt seen, not used. Even the old priests admired her curiosity. Ksas, they said the goddess Isis whispered through her mind. But Cleopatra didn't pray for favor. She worked for it. She walked through markets in plain clothes, listening to merchants argue over prices and taxes. She wanted to feel the pulse of Egypt, to understand its hunger and its hope. The air of Alexandria was heavy with unrest. Poverty grew, and loyalty faded. Yet in her eyes burned the dream of restoration. Egypt, she vowed, would rise again. The nobles dismissed her as young and idealistic. They couldn't see the fire behind her calm. One tutor, old Myron, warned her gently. Knowledge brings danger to those not born to wield it. She smiled and replied, "Then I'll learn to wield it better than any man." That was Cleopatra, never loud, always deliberate. Every word a step closer to power, she began to wear symbols of Egyptian gods, not as decoration, but as declaration. To the Greeks, she was royal blood. To the Egyptians, she was becoming one of their own. She learned their language, their songs, their prayers. No Ptolemaic ruler before her had done this. When she spoke in the temple of Isis, the priests bowed as if the goddess had returned. The people started whispering her name with reverence. To them, she was not foreign, she was hope. Her father noticed this change, and fear crept into his heart. He saw her influence spreading beyond the palace. He began to see her as both daughter and rival. Cleopatra did not fight him. She waited. She knew timing was more powerful than rebellion. She watched as his debts to Rome deepened, as his choices weakened Egypt's spirit. And she knew, sooner or later, she would be called to save what he could not. But destiny never comes gently. It tests before it rewards. Whispers of betrayal grew louder. The court became a nest of serpents once again. Still, Cleopatra stood composed, her silence louder than their noise. She found comfort in the stars above the Nile. They reminded her that greatness required solitude. Sometimes she dreamed of being ordinary, but her purpose would not allow it. The world outside the palace awaited her touch. The throne awaited its true queen, and when dawn came, painting the horizon in gold, she stood by her window, unafraid of what was coming, because within her heart, she had already chosen her path. The path of responsibility, not ease. The path of wisdom, not luxury. And as the wind swept through her hair, she whispered softly, "Let them doubt me." Her eyes glowed with quiet certainty. For I was born to lead, not to follow. The seeds of power had taken root, and soon the world would see them bloom. The scent of myrrh filled the palace halls. The king was dying, and the kingdom trembled. Cleopatra stood by his bedside, calm yet distant. Her father, King Lysis, had lost his strength to time. His eyes flickered between guilt and fear. He had ruled long, but not well. Debt chained Egypt to Rome. The nobles whispered of rebellion. Cleopatra watched his frail hands clutch the sheets. Even in weakness, he feared losing control. He looked at her and saw both comfort and threat. The daughter who might surpass him or replace him. But Cleopatra did not crave his throne out of pride. She wanted to restore what he had broken. Outside, priests prayed to the gods for mercy. Inside, the air hung heavy with secrets. When the last breath escaped his lips, the torches dimmed and destiny awakened. By his will, Cleopatra would share the throne with her younger brother, Prince Theon. She was 18, he was 10, and already ambition burned in his eyes. It was tradition, they said. Brother and sister ruling side by side. But traditions, Cleopatra knew, were often cages dressed in gold. She bowed before the court, composed as marble. The nobles whispered, too young, too bold. Yet behind her calm smile, plans unfolded. She would not share power. She would earn it. At first, she tried to guide her brother, to teach him the art of leadership. But the men around him poisoned his mind. They told him, a woman cannot rule Egypt. Theon began to see her as an enemy, and the palace began to turn against her. Cleopatra refused to strike first. Patience, she knew, was the weapon of the wise. She watched how her enemies moved, how they spoke, how they underestimated her. She learned their rhythms like music, and waited for the right note to change the tune. But danger came faster than she expected. The court turned cold. The guards changed sides. Letters disappeared. Servants vanished. Loyalty had become currency, and hers was running out. One night, footsteps echoed through her chambers. A messenger whispered, "They plan to arrest you by dawn." Cleopatra didn't panic. She prepared. She packed scrolls, jewels, and silence. Under the pale moon, she escaped the palace gates, her sandals pressed against the sand of exile. Behind her, Alexandria slept in false peace. Ahead, the desert waited, vast and unforgiving. The wind howled across the dunes, as if warning her of the trials ahead. But Cleopatra did not fear the dark. She had been born among shadows. Now, those shadows would hide her, not harm her. She looked back once, the palace shining faintly under the stars. Then she whispered, "Let them take the throne. For I will return, and they will kneel," her followers, few but loyal. Saw not a fugitive, but a queen reborn. The exile had begun. But so had the rise of something unstoppable. For that night, in the silence of the desert, Cleopatra made a vow. She would reclaim Egypt, not as a daughter of a king, but as its rightful ruler. Her father's crown had passed away with his breath. But her reign, her true reign, had just begun. The desert stretched endless beneath the burning sun. Each grain of sand whispered a challenge: survive or surrender. Cleopatra rode with only a handful of loyal souls. Come. Behind her, the palace glittered like a memory she refused to mourn. The heat bit her skin, but her heart burned hotter. The world had taken her crown. It would have to fight to keep it. At night, she slept beneath the stars, their cold light reflecting in her eyes. Fear visited often, but she never welcomed it to stay. She had lost her kingdom, her power, her safety, but not her faith. Because true royalty, she realized, was not born from gold, but from endurance. Each morning she rose before dawn, writing plans in the sand before the wind erased them. Every plan ended with one truth: she would return. She would rule again. The people who had betrayed her would learn her silence was strength. Her patience was power. Even in exile, she studied. The desert became her classroom. She learned the rhythm of storms, the patience of waiting, the courage of emptiness. She began to understand leadership not as privilege, but as responsibility. One evening, as the horizon burned red, Cleopatra called her followers close. They were tired, sunburned, hungry, but they still looked to her for hope, and she gave it freely. Her voice steady as the Nile. "They think I am gone," she said. "But I am learning what they never will: resilience." The men nodded, some crying quietly into their cloaks. They would die for her if she asked. Because she never asked for loyalty, she inspired it. Rumors traveled faster than armies. Whispers reached the markets of Alexandria. Cleopatra still lived. The people began to speak her name again, softly, like a prayer. Meanwhile, in the capital, her brother Theon ruled blindly. Guided by corrupt advisors, he bled Egypt's wealth to Rome. The empire watched, waiting to strike. Egypt's throne had never looked weaker, and that weakness, Cleopatra knew, was her invitation back. But she needed more than courage. She needed allies. Across the sea, Rome's power grew like a storm. Its generals fought for glory, its senators for control. Among them was one man whose name carried thunder, Julius Caesar. Warrior, strategist, ruler of men. Cleopatra studied his victories by the firelight. His ambition mirrored her own. And when word reached her that Caesar had arrived in Alexandria, she felt destiny stir once more. She could not walk through the palace gates. Her enemies waited there with knives and smiles, so she planned something bolder. Something only Cleopatra could conceive. She would meet Caesar not as a beggar, but as a revelation. In a quiet camp by the river, she whispered her plan. Her most trusted servant, old Myron, listened in awe. "You mean to risk your life," he said softly. She smiled. To reclaim it. That night, they wrapped her in a thick carpet, a royal gift bound for Caesar's chambers. As the moon hid behind the clouds, they carried her through secret doors and guarded halls. The palace that once exiled her would now witness her return. But not as a fugitive, as fate itself. When the carpet was unrolled before the Roman general, the air shifted like a storm about to break. There she stood, radiant, fearless, alive. The queen the desert could not kill. Caesar's eyes met hers. And in that silent instant, two empires collided. She spoke first, her voice calm as the Nile. "I was born to rule Egypt, not to beg for it." Caesar smiled, seeing not just beauty, but brilliance. That night changed history. And Cleopatra, once exiled and forgotten, stepped back into her destiny. Because even when the world buried her in sand, she refused to stay buried. The exile had taught her the meaning of power. Now, she would use it. She had lost everything except her fire. And that fire would soon set the world ablaze. The palace was silent when Caesar first saw her, a Roman conqueror and an Egyptian storm. Cleopatra rose from the unrolled carpet, her eyes calm, her presence unshakable. Caesar had seen countless rulers bow before him, but never one who looked at him as an equal. He expected fear. She gave him fascination. He expected flattery. She offered truth. "I have no army," she said softly, "but I have a country worth fighting for." Caesar studied her, intrigued. This was no ordinary queen. Her voice carried confidence without arrogance, grace without surrender. Around them, torches flickered like restless spirits. History itself paused to listen. Cleopatra spoke of betrayal and exile, of the hunger she had seen in her people's eyes. She did not cry. She reasoned. She did not beg. She persuaded. Her words were precise as arrows, aimed not at Caesar's pride, but at his vision. "You conquer nations," she said, "but I can win hearts. Together, we could rule both." For the first time in years, Caesar smiled with genuine admiration. He saw more than beauty. He saw intelligence, rare, dangerous, magnetic. That night, they spoke for hours, of politics, of destiny, of power. Cleopatra's wit cut sharper than any sword. Her curiosity disarmed him completely. She did not fear him. She fascinated him. And fascination is the beginning of all alliances. Outside, Alexandria slept unaware, that the course of history had changed. Inside, two minds began to shape an empire. Days later, Caesar declared his support for Cleopatra. The court erupted in chaos. Theon's advisors called her a traitor. They demanded Caesar leave Egypt. But Caesar was not a man easily commanded. He summoned the royal family to judgment. Cleopatra entered the chamber draped in white linen. Her steps silent, her head high. Theon arrived trembling beside his guards. His youth exposed before the Roman might. The room thickened with tension. Every word felt like a blade unsheathed. Caesar's gaze moved between the siblings. Then he spoke, clear, unyielding. "Egypt will have one ruler," he said. "And I choose Cleopatra." Gasps rippled through the court. Theon's face twisted in rage. He shouted, cursed, and fled the hall. War was inevitable, but Cleopatra did not flinch. She had been waiting for this. Within days, Alexandria became a battlefield. The streets that once sang now screamed. Caesar's legions clashed with Theon's rebels. The Nile ran dark beneath the setting sun. Cleopatra commanded from the shadows, sending word, supplies, and courage to her allies. She was not just a queen to be protected. She was a strategist to be obeyed. Theon's army, young and desperate, could not match the precision of Rome. In the chaos of fire and sword, Cleopatra's destiny sharpened. The palace she once fled was now her fortress. The city she loved burned for her cause. Days turned into weeks of relentless siege. Theon's forces weakened. Their faith crumbled. When at last the battle ended, the boy king was gone, drowned in his own escape. The rebellion was crushed. Egypt had a queen once more. But Cleopatra did not celebrate victory with arrogance. She walked among the wounded, silent and humbled. She knew what it had cost. Lives, loyalty, and innocence. Caesar found her standing by the river, watching smoke rise over the city. "You have your throne," he said. "What will you do with it?" She turned to him slowly, her eyes reflecting both grief and fire. "Rebuild," she whispered. "And this time, make it unbreakable." In the weeks that followed, Cleopatra began to reshape her kingdom. She restored order, lowered taxes, and reopened the markets of Alexandria. The temples filled with song again. The people knelt not out of fear, but hope. Every reform carried her signature. Every decree bore her conviction. She ruled not from distance, but from understanding, and beside her stood Caesar, the world's most powerful man, now her ally. Their bond deepened beyond politics. Respect became admiration. Admiration became desire. Desire became destiny. Together, they were unstoppable. The conqueror and the queen. Cleopatra once ruled from fear. Now she ruled from purpose. The girl who once wandered the desert now commanded nations with her voice. When she stood beside Caesar before the people, cheers thundered like storms. Egypt had its queen again. And this time, the world was watching. Because she had proven that exile could not break her, and betrayal could not define her. She had returned, stronger, wiser, eternal. The Queen of Egypt, and soon, the Queen of Hearts. Alexandria rose from its ashes, and with it, the legend of Cleopatra. The city that once whispered her name in fear now shouted it in triumph. Banners of gold fluttered along the Nile. Temples reopened. Markets filled. Hearts awakened. The queen had returned, not as her father's daughter, but as Egypt's soul. She walked among her people, veiled yet radiant. Children followed. Merchants bowed. Priests wept. The streets sang her name like a hymn. Cleopatra, the living goddess. But Cleopatra didn't seek worship. She sought restoration. Her kingdom had bled under greed and ignorance. Now she would heal it, not with force, but with wisdom. Her first decree, fair trade for all citizens. Her second, education for the poor. Because knowledge, she said, was the greatest treasure. She met with farmers, builders, philosophers, listened, questioned, remembered every word. She was not a ruler above her people. She was a mirror of their pain. And in that reflection, they found hope again. Even Rome looked at Egypt differently. They saw not a broken province, but a rising power. Caesar watched with admiration as she rebuilt. He had conquered kingdoms, but she rebuilt souls. They met often by the river at dusk. Two minds bound by ambition and something deeper. Cleopatra spoke of her dream: to unite the spirit of Egypt with the strength of Rome. Caesar smiled. You think like a ruler. She replied, no, I think like a survivor. Their alliance grew stronger. A bridge between empires, built on respect and fire. In private, whispers spread of their closeness. In public, they stood as symbols of power reborn. One night, as torches flickered through the palace gardens, Cleopatra stood before the statue of Isis. She laid her hand on the cold stone and whispered, I will honor you, not by praying, but by acting. The wind carried her vow across the river, a promise sealed between queen and goddess. Soon after, she gathered her scholars and generals. Plans unfolded, new ports, new roads, new schools. The city thrived. The Nile seemed to flow stronger beneath her reign. For the first time in years, Egypt stood tall again. Proud, rich, united. The people adored her not for her crown, but for her courage. Yet power is never without a price. Rome began to whisper of her influence over Caesar. Senators called her the foreign queen. They feared her mind more than her beauty, but Cleopatra remained calm. She had faced worse than gossip. While others played politics, she played destiny. Her focus never left her land, her people, her vision. Each morning, she rose before sunrise. She watched the light touch the water and whispered, "Thank you." She was no longer the girl in exile. She was the woman who had returned unbroken, and deep inside, she knew this peace would not last forever. The world would test her again. It always does to those who rise too high. But she was ready. She had walked through fire and learned to dance within it. For Cleopatra, every triumph carried a shadow. Every victory reminded her of what could be lost. Still, she chose to lead with grace, to rule with empathy, not ego, because true power, she believed, was not domination, it was understanding. And as night fell over Alexandria once more, the queen stood on her balcony in silence. The river glimmered, the stars bowed, and the wind whispered her name, softly, endlessly. Cleopatra, the queen who had returned, the queen who would never bow again. The palace glowed beneath the Roman moon. And there, power met passion. Cleopatra and Caesar stood on the balcony, two worlds breathing the same ambition. He had conquered nations through war. She conquered through wisdom. Together, they became a force that neither Rome nor Egypt could ignore. Rivals whispered, destiny had chosen its pair. Their meetings grew longer, their words sharper, their silences deeper. Caesar admired her intelligence, a mind that saw beyond borders and crowns. Cleopatra admired his discipline, the strength to command men and shape empires. Yet between strategy and diplomacy, something softer began to rise: connection. It was not the love of weakness, but the love of equals. When they spoke, even the walls seemed to listen. When they planned, history leaned closer. He taught her the art of war. She taught him the science of influence. Together, they designed trade routes, alliances, reforms. Their vision reached beyond their time. But their bond did more than build nations. It shook them. Rome began to whisper of scandal. How can a queen rule the heart of a conqueror? Cleopatra ignored them. She had faced exile. What were rumors to her now? Instead, she focused on the future. Her future and Egypt's. When she told Caesar she was with child, his eyes softened in a way no one had ever seen. She named the boy Caesarion, Little Caesar, born from love and destiny. To Cleopatra, he was more than a son. He was a symbol, the bridge between two worlds. Rome's blood and Egypt's soul, united in one heartbeat. She believed one day he would rule both lands, bringing peace where there had only been conquest. For a while, happiness filled the palace. The Nile shimmered like gold. Cleopatra walked through her gardens at dawn, her child in her arms, her kingdom at peace. She had known exile, betrayal, loneliness. Now, she knew joy. But joy, in power, is fragile. And the higher she rose, the more the shadows watched. In Rome, Caesar's enemies sharpened their blades. They feared his growing power, and hers. They called her the Witch of the East, a woman who had enslaved the great Caesar with beauty and cunning. Yet Cleopatra did not chase their approval. She chased purpose. She stood beside Caesar not as a mistress, but as a partner in empire. Their conversations echoed through corridors, not of love alone, but of legacy. One night, under torchlight, Caesar said, "The world will remember you, Cleopatra." She smiled. "Then let it remember us." It was more than affection. It was prophecy. Two spirits defying centuries of order. As they sailed down the Nile together, their laughter mixed with the wind. Caesar admired the temples, the pyramids, the eternal river. He saw a civilization older than his own. And Cleopatra saw something in him, a man who could dream without limit. They were both builders, both believers, both doomed by their brilliance. For power never forgives those who hold it too gracefully, and passion never hides from envy. Whispers turned to anger. Anger turned to threat. Rome demanded Caesar return. His time in Egypt had made him too powerful, too independent. Cleopatra knew what was coming. She had seen it before, the jealousy of small men. Still, she did not plead. She only said, "Go. But remember, the Nile flows in your veins now." Caesar kissed her hand, the gesture of a man torn between duty and desire. Then he left, to face a Senate that waited with daggers behind smiles. Cleopatra watched his ship fade into the horizon. The wind carried her whisper across the waves, "Return." But deep down, she knew the truth. When greatness walks among men, it rarely returns unscathed. And as the river moved beneath her feet, Cleopatra felt a shadow cross her heart. The same shadow that always follows love, the shadow of loss. Still, she stood tall beneath the stars, because though fate was cruel, she would not bend. She was queen, mother, lover, legend, the heart of Egypt, and the spark of Rome. Her reign had begun in exile. Her power now spanned empires. Tuts. But soon, destiny would ask its price. And Cleopatra, as always, would pay it with grace. Chunt. The streets of Rome had never seen such splendor. Trumpets roared, crowds surged, and whispers filled the air. Cleopatra had arrived, not as a guest, but as a storm cloaked in gold. Her chariots shimmered beneath the sun, drawn by white horses and silence heavy with awe. Behind her marched servants carrying treasures of Egypt, ivory, jewels, and the scent of lotus blossoms. Rome, proud and disciplined, paused to stare. Men called her dangerous. Women called her divine. Caesar waited at the steps of his palace, his eyes both proud and cautious. Cleopatra stepped forward, her head high. Every movement precise, every breath deliberate. She bowed to no one. Even Rome felt her presence. For the first time, the conqueror and the queen stood together before the world. Caesar saw admiration in her eyes, and danger. She saw admiration in his, and fear. He led her through marble corridors, where senators whispered and guards refused to meet her gaze. To the Romans, she was temptation wearing a crown. To Caesar, she was possibility. In the days that followed, Cleopatra lived in a villa by the Tiber. Rome watched her every step. She hosted banquets scented with Egyptian myrrh, her laughter echoing through Roman nights. She dressed not as a captive, but as a queen whose power crossed seas. Caesar visited often, drawn to her brilliance. Together they spoke of empire and eternity. But beyond the walls, envy stirred. The Senate feared her influence, and his weakness. How can the ruler of Rome kneel to a foreign queen? They whispered in candlelit halls. Cleopatra ignored their venom. She had faced venom before, in flesh and in spirit. Still, she noticed Caesar growing distant. The burden of Rome weighed heavier each day. He had conquered the world, but could not conquer his own city. Yet their bond remained unspoken, unbroken. They shared a son, a secret, and a dream. When she walked through the gardens with little Caesarion, the servants bowed twice, once for her, once for the future. She imagined him one day uniting both worlds, Rome's power with Egypt's soul. But dreams are fragile when envy breathes near them, and Rome had stopped breathing long ago. Rumors twisted into hatred. The Senate gathered behind closed doors. They feared not Cleopatra's armies, but her ideas, her independence, her brilliance. For what frightened men more than a powerful woman they could not control. Then came the day the whispers turned to knives. The Ides of March, the day Caesar fell. Cleopatra's guards burst into her villa with trembling faces, their words cut sharper than any blade. "He's gone," they said. "Caesar is dead." For a moment, the world stopped turning. Even the river outside seemed to hold its breath. She stood in silence, holding her son, as tears burned behind her calm eyes. The empire that had once embraced her now turned against her in rage. In the chaos that followed, she gathered her treasures, scrolls, gold, memories, and left Rome before dawn. Her ship sailed quietly down the Tiber, away from the city of betrayal. Behind her, fires of ambition consumed everything Caesar had built. Before her, the sea opened, dark and uncertain. She looked back one last time. The city glittered under the moon, proud and blind. Then she whispered, "They can kill the man, but not the vision." The wind carried her voice toward the horizon. Back to Egypt, back to destiny. She had lost her ally, her love, her safety, but she still had her purpose. And that, she knew, was more powerful than any crown. For Cleopatra had never been just a queen. She was the fire behind empires. And even in grief, she refused to fade. The sea roared as Cleopatra's ship neared Alexandria. The waves mourned, the wind whispered, Caesar was gone. She stood at the bow in silence, the child in her arms, the storm in her eyes. Rome had taken from her what exile could not. Her heart, her ally, her dream. But grief, for Cleopatra, was never weakness. It was transformation. When she stepped back onto Egyptian soil, her people gathered, uncertain but hopeful. They saw sorrow in their queen's face, but also something fiercer, resolve. She had lost Caesar, but not the reason she fought beside him. Egypt still needed her, and she would never abandon it again. In the months that followed, she rebuilt her strength. She turned loss into focus. The palace that once echoed with laughter now became a fortress of purpose. Cleopatra surrounded herself with thinkers, architects, and healers. She restored temples, reopened schools, and revived the treasury. Her first command to her generals was simple: protect Egypt at all costs. Rome was no longer friend or enemy. It was a reminder that trust is fragile. At night, she stood on her balcony, the stars reflecting in her tears. Caesar's voice lingered in her mind. "You were born for greatness," she whispered back. "Then greatness I shall become." She taught Caesarion to walk among the gardens, not as a prince, but as a student. "Power," she told him, "is not what you hold in your hands. It's what you hold in your heart." He listened with wide eyes, his tiny fingers clutching her robes. The people adored the boy, calling him the child of the sun and the lion. Cleopatra saw in him both legacy and danger. Rome would never forget Caesar's bloodline, but she would protect him, even if it meant defying the world again. She trained her army, strengthened her fleets, and rebuilt Egypt's alliances across the sea. Under her rule, gold flowed, scholars returned, and hope awakened like spring. Even her enemies in the desert tribes sent envoys bearing gifts of peace. Cleopatra had turned mourning into motion. Every scar became strategy. She refused to wear black. Instead, she wore white and gold, symbols of renewal. "Let them see," she said to her servants, "that I am not buried with him." Yet, in the quiet hours of night, when the torches dimmed and the city slept, she allowed herself to remember. The laughter, the plans, the promise. She would stand at the water's edge, the moon glowing like a coin on the river, and she would whisper his name, not in grief, but in gratitude. Because through Caesar, she had learned that love could be a kind of power. And through his death, she learned that power must be protected. News of his assassination spread like fire. Rome split apart, generals fighting, loyalties breaking. One name rose above the chaos: Octavian, Caesar's heir. Another, Mark Antony, his fiercest general. Cleopatra watched from afar, her heart steady. She knew Rome would soon come knocking again. But this time, she would not wait for help. She would decide her own alliances, for she had learned the hardest truth of all. Empires do not fall in war. They fall in weakness, and Cleopatra refused to be weak. One evening, as lightning flashed across the Nile, she held her son close and whispered, "The world took your father. It will not take your future." Her words carried across the water, through the darkness, through time. The Queen of Egypt had lost her love, but she had found her purpose again. And soon, destiny would test her once more. For beyond the sea, a new power was rising. And with it, a new chapter of her legend was about to begin. The throne of Egypt gleamed beneath the morning light, but beside it, no one stood. Cleopatra ruled alone, and solitude, she learned, is the sharpest crown of all. The palace echoed with silence, once filled by laughter. Every step reminded her of what power costs. Caesar's ghost lingered in her halls, not as sorrow, but as a warning. He had trusted too freely. She would not. Cleopatra's heart hardened, but her vision stayed clear. She ruled not from grief, but from wisdom. The ministers approached her with trembling hands. They feared her calm more than her anger. Her words were soft, her gaze unblinking. When she spoke, even generals bowed lower. Under her command, Egypt thrived again. Trade flourished, schools reopened, order returned. She restored balance to a kingdom once bleeding, and the people saw her not just as queen, but as guardian. She visited temples barefoot, offering incense to Isis. She stood among the people, not above them. Every gesture carried purpose, every silence, power. She was more than royal, She was ritual itself. Her rule became poetry, disciplined and divine. Yet at night, the queen turned human. Loneliness pressed against her gold walls like a tide. The bed felt too wide, the silence too loyal. She often sat by the window, watching the river shimmer beneath moonlight. Some nights she spoke to it, softly. "The Nile never stops flowing," she said, "so neither will I." Her advisors urged her to remarry, to secure alliances and protect her throne. But Cleopatra refused. Love, she knew, could build, but also destroy. She trusted no man's promise, only her own determination. Still, the world beyond Egypt stirred restlessly. Rome's civil wars raged on. Two names divided the empire, Octavian and Mark Antony, and both watched Egypt from afar. Cleopatra remained cautious, studying their every move. She knew sooner or later, one would come to her shores. Until then, she ruled with patience and precision. Her days filled with decisions, her nights with thought. She trained young Caesarion in diplomacy and command. He was her pride, her reason, her fragile hope. Together, they walked through the palace gardens. She taught him not just to lead, but to listen. So, power, she told him, is not what men see. It's what they feel when you enter the room. He nodded, repeating her words like prayer, and in his eyes, she saw the future she fought for. Still, doubt followed her like a shadow. She wondered if the gods demanded too much. But each time uncertainty whispered, she answered with action. A new library rose by the harbor, a temple restored in her mother's name. Every act, a rebellion against despair. Every day, proof that she still endured. Her enemies called her cold, her people called her eternal. And perhaps both were true. Because beneath the calm surface, a storm waited. A storm she had learned to control, but never silence. For in Cleopatra's heart, power and loneliness were now the same flame. And though the world saw her as unshakable, she knew she was still human beneath the crown. One night, as thunder rolled across the Nile, she whispered to the gods, "If I must stand alone, so be it." The lightning flashed, a silent answer. The Queen of Egypt stood, unbroken, unafraid. Her throne was empty beside her, but her reign was full. And far beyond the horizon, fate began to stir once more. A name carried on the wind, Mark Antony, and with it, the next chapter of her destiny. The world beyond Egypt burned with ambition. Rome, restless and divided, searched for a new master. Octavian, cold and calculating, claimed Caesar's legacy. Mark Antony, bold and fiery, claimed Caesar's spirit. And Cleopatra watched from her throne, knowing both would soon shape her fate. Her spies whispered of their rivalry, two men bound by alliance, but split by desire. Octavian ruled with law, Antony ruled with loyalty. And Egypt held what both men needed most: wealth, grain, power. Cleopatra studied every rumor like a general studies maps. For her, politics was not a game, it was survival. She had seen Rome's hunger before. its armies cloaked in friendship, its generals masked in smiles. But she also saw opportunity. And Cleopatra never ignored opportunity. In her private chambers, she traced the lines of a map. Her fingers rested on Tarsus, the city where Antony now ruled. He had sent word to her, an invitation to discuss alliance and tribute. Her advisors trembled. They remembered Caesar. They feared another Roman trap. But Cleopatra's eyes glowed with certainty. "Power," she said, "is not something you avoid. It's something you meet." She remembered Caesar's death, how envy had destroyed greatness. She would not repeat history. She would write her own. The queen began to prepare her arrival, not with soldiers, but with spectacle. If Antony ruled through strength, she would rule through wonder. Her ships gleamed with gold and silver. Purple sails caught the wind like wings of twilight. Perfumed smoke rose from the decks, carrying the scent of lotus and myrrh across the sea. Her servants dressed as gods and muses. Music floated over the waves like prophecy. Cleopatra would not go as a petitioner. She would go as a vision. As the fleet sailed north, she stood at the bow, calm and unshaken. The wind tangled her hair, but her gaze never left the horizon. Her heart was steady, not in love, but in control. For she knew what she carried was not vanity, but strategy. Tarsus awaited her, a city of marble and pride. Mark Antony, the warlord of Rome, watched the harbor from his balcony. When he saw the golden ships appear against the setting sun, even his soldiers stopped breathing. "Who sails with such audacity?" one asked. Antony smiled. "Only a queen." As Cleopatra's vessel approached, the river shimmered as though welcoming its goddess. Drums echoed across the water. Crowds gathered, drawn by beauty they could not comprehend. When she finally stepped ashore, the air shifted, as if the earth itself bowed. Her gown flowed like liquid gold. Her eyes, fierce and steady, met Antony's without hesitation. For a heartbeat, time forgot to move. The warrior and the queen, fire and flame. Antony extended his hand. Cleopatra took it slowly, deliberately. "Welcome to Tarsus," he said with a grin. "Welcome to history," she replied. That night, the two dined beneath starlight. Wine flowed, laughter echoed, and strategy was disguised as charm. He spoke of Rome's wars. She spoke of Egypt's endurance. He admired her wit, her poise, her defiance. She saw in him not a conqueror, but a partner in chaos. Two souls shaped by ambition, two hearts carved by loss. By dawn, an alliance was forming, and something deeper stirring. The world would soon call it love. But for Cleopatra, it was more than that. It was destiny awakening once again. For she had met a man who could match her fire, and together they would set the world ablaze. The queen had survived betrayal, exile, and loss. Now, she would rise again, not alone, but unstoppable. And as the sun rose over Tarsus, its light caught her crown and turned it into flame. A new empire was rising, and its heartbeat was hers. The message arrived on a scroll sealed in wax. It bore the mark of Mark Antony himself. Cleopatra broke it open with calm hands. Her eyes scanned the words. An invitation, or perhaps a test. "Come to Tarsus," it read. "Let us speak of peace, of tribute, of alliance." Her ministers panicked. "It is a trap, my queen. Rome never invites. It commands." Cleopatra smiled faintly, her voice soft but sharp. "Then I shall teach them that Egypt does not obey." The hall fell silent. Everyone in that room knew. She had already decided. Antony wanted to summon her like a vassal. She would arrive like a goddess. Preparations began that very night. Not for war, but for a performance the world would never forget. Cleopatra turned diplomacy into art. She understood that appearance was its own kind of power. "If I cannot outnumber them," she said, "I will outshine them." Her fleet was assembled, golden ships with purple sails. The oarsmen rowed in rhythm to flutes and drums. Perfume drifted across the river like incense in a temple. The sails caught firelight, shimmering like the wings of angels. She dressed not as a queen, but as Aphrodite reborn. Jewels glimmered on her wrists like captured stars. Her attendants, dressed as gods, surrounded her throne on deck. And when the wind rose, even the Nile seemed to kneel. She was no longer just Cleopatra. She was Egypt itself, beauty, power, and mystery woven into form. When the fleet reached Tarsus, the city stopped to breathe. Crowds gathered on the riverbanks, their voices drowned by awe. Mark Antony stood on his balcony, his usual arrogance faltering for the first time. He had expected a monarch. He saw a miracle. The queen stepped from her ship, the scent of lotus following her every step. Her gaze found Antony's, steady and unbroken. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. For that instant, the world belonged only to them, two rulers who recognized themselves in each other. Antony descended the steps, his laughter breaking the tension like thunder. "You arrive as if you own the sea," she smiled. "Only the part that obeys me." Their conversation began like a duel. Words instead of swords, wit instead of shields. He tested her pride. She tested his patience. Neither yielded, both admired. By nightfall, the tension had turned electric. Banquets replaced battles, and curiosity replaced suspicion. Cleopatra spoke of Egypt's resilience, its temples, its wisdom, its gods. Antony listened, fascinated. He had fought 100 wars, yet never met a mind like hers. She spoke of stars and fate, of empires built not by force, but by vision. Her words painted pictures no general could resist. He saw in her the fire he had long buried. When the music began, the air shimmered with something unspoken. Chant. Cleopatra danced, not with motion, but with presence. Every glance, every breath, command disguised as grace. Antony, for once, forgot conquest. He forgot Rome, duty, war. He saw only her, the queen who dared to meet him as an equal. And in that realization, admiration turned to something dangerous. The night ended in silence. The kind that changes everything. When Cleopatra returned to her ship, Antony stood watching from the shore. The torches burned low, and the river carried their reflections like prophecy. He whispered to himself, "She came when I summoned her, yet somehow I was the one conquered." And deep inside, Cleopatra smiled, for she knew she had won the first battle without drawing a sword. The Queen of Egypt had arrived, and history had just taken a new breath. The days that followed shimmered like a dream. Mark Antony could command legions, but not his thoughts of her. Cleopatra lingered in his mind like perfume on steel, a woman who spoke like a ruler and moved like a myth. He had met countless queens, warriors, and courtesans, but never one who turned conversation into conquest. When they met again in his marble hall, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. She entered with quiet grace, dressed in white and gold. Antony rose, not as a general, but as a man in awe. "Queen of Egypt," he said softly, "your presence burns brighter than my torches." Cleopatra smiled. "Fire is drawn to fire, my lord." He laughed, but in his eyes flickered something deeper. Respect, desire, and danger intertwined. Over wine and music, they spoke of empires. She asked him not of battles, but of purpose. "What do you fight for?" she asked. "Victory," he replied. She leaned closer, her voice low. "And when victory grows lonely, what then?" Antony fell silent. For the first time in years, he had no answer. Cleopatra's eyes gleamed with understanding. She had found his weakness, emptiness disguised as power. And he had found hers, purpose disguised as calm. In that stillness, a spark ignited. Not lust, recognition. They saw in each other the reflection of hunger, two souls shaped by loss, destined to collide. From that night, their alliance became unbreakable. Together, they feasted, laughed, and planned. They hunted beneath silver moons. They sailed the Nile, sharing stories and dreams. Antony, once a warrior of Rome, became a student of Egypt's mysteries. Cleopatra showed him temples carved in stone and silence. She spoke of the gods who watched over their people. He listened, humbled by her depth. She rules like the river, he thought, gentle, yet unstoppable. But their bond was not only tenderness. It was forged in strategy and strength. Cleopatra understood Antony's ambition. She saw the soldier who craved more than war. "You could be more than Rome's sword," she told him. "You could be its mind." He laughed, dismissing the thought, but her words lingered. She spoke not to flatter, but to awaken. And Antony, unknowingly, began to change. He wrote to her daily when apart, letters sealed with wax and longing. In each one, he confessed what he could not say aloud, that he felt alive only in her presence. When he returned to Alexandria, the city erupted in celebration. The queen and the general, united. The goddess and the warrior, one flame. Days became nights of revelry and devotion. They hosted feasts that lasted till dawn. Song, wine, laughter, and music filled the air. Yet beneath it all, strategy burned. Together they planned trade routes, alliances, and expansion. Their love was not distraction, it was momentum. Antony needed Cleopatra's wealth. Cleopatra needed Antony's legions. But between need and desire, a new truth formed. They were strongest together. They rode through the desert side by side, their laughter echoing against the dunes. He called her my Star of the East. She called him my Lion of Rome. Whispers spread through both empires. Some called it love, others called it danger. But neither cared. They had found purpose in each other's fire. When Antony returned to Rome briefly, he left a piece of himself behind. Cleopatra watched his ship disappear once more, but this time she did not feel fear, for she knew he would come back. Not for power, but for her. Months later, when he returned, the city of Alexandria greeted him like a king. Together they walked through the palace gardens, hand in hand beneath the scent of jasmine. "You once said victory grows lonely," she whispered. "Does it still?" He looked at her and smiled. Not anymore. They built palaces of gold and marble by the river. They celebrated the birth of their children. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. Cleopatra saw in them the future of two worlds. Egypt's grace and Rome's might bound by love. But love, like fire, always attracts wind. And wind brings whispers. Rome began to rage once more. Antony's alliance with Cleopatra angered Octavian. He called her a temptress, and Antony, a traitor blinded by lust. Cleopatra's name filled Roman scrolls with venom. Her beauty became their excuse, her power, their fear. But she remained unshaken. Let them talk, let them tremble. She had seen this before. The fear of men who could not control what they envied. In her private chamber, she looked out over the Nile. Antony entered quietly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "They hate what we have," he murmured. She replied, "Then let them hate greatness." Outside, thunder rolled over the horizon. A storm gathering from the west, but in that moment, neither cared. For their empire, built on love and defiance, still burned bright. And though the world plotted against them, Cleopatra whispered one promise into the night. "They can fight us, curse us, destroy our names, but they will never erase our fire, for their bond was not of flesh. It was forged in destiny, and destiny, once awakened, does not bow to Rome." The world began to shift again. Rome's peace was breaking, and love stood at its center. From the marble halls of power, Octavian watched in silence. His letters grew sharper, his patience colder. To him, Mark Antony was no longer an ally. He was a man bewitched, enslaved by a queen from the east. Whispers turned to rumors, and rumors turned to war cries. The Senate filled with venom. They said Cleopatra had bewitched Antony's mind, that she had drowned his Roman honor in Egyptian gold, that his heart no longer beat for Rome, but for her. Cleopatra heard these rumors from her spies. She did not tremble. She only smiled. "They fear what they do not understand," she said. "And they cannot understand a woman with power." Antony returned to Alexandria, his face marked by exhaustion and pride. He had defied Rome and chosen her. But the choice came with a cost. He was married to Octavian's sister, Octavia. His love for Cleopatra turned that bond into betrayal. Rome called him traitor. Cleopatra called him free. In Egypt, they stood together on the golden balcony, their hands clasped, their eyes steady. Below them, the people cheered. To them, this was not scandal, it was destiny. Cleopatra and Antony ruled side by side. They shared thrones, armies, and dreams. He granted her new lands, and together they rebuilt Egypt's strength. But power, when shared, always draws fire. Octavian began to prepare his attack. He sent messages across the empire, painting Cleopatra as a serpent, a witch, a threat. He said she sought to overthrow Rome itself. He said Antony had given her Caesar's throne. The propaganda spread like wildfire. Every word a blade, every story a spark. Even Antony's soldiers began to question. Was their commander still Roman, or something else entirely? Cleopatra saw the shadow in his eyes, the quiet guilt that gnawed at him. One night, as torches flickered in the wind, she spoke softly, but without pity. You cannot serve two masters, my love. Not Rome, and not your heart. Antony turned away, his fists clenched. I have given Rome everything. She stepped closer, her voice calm as a river. Then give yourself to something that gives back. He met her gaze, and in it, found peace again. A peace he had not known since Caesar's wars. Together, they made a choice that changed history. They declared themselves rulers of the East. Their children were crowned as princes of Egypt and Syria. The ceremony glittered with divine splendor. Cleopatra wore gold like sunlight itself. Antony stood beside her, his armor reflecting flame. The people rejoiced. But in Rome, Octavian seethed. He called them arrogant, sacrilegious. He vowed to bring them both to their knees. Letters turned to threats. Threats turned to legions, and as ships gathered on both sides of the sea, Cleopatra stood upon her balcony, unflinching. She looked at Antony and saw not a man of Rome, but a man of fate. They were two flames burning too brightly to last. But together, they refused to dim. In their palace, the air grew heavy with anticipation. The drums of war echoed from the west. Cleopatra did not hide her fear. She mastered it. She planned, calculated, prepared. Antony gathered his legions, his faith renewed by her fire. They trained by torchlight. The queen walking among soldiers like a blessing of courage. To them, she was not mortal. She was Egypt itself, fierce, loyal, divine. One evening, as the army knelt before her, Cleopatra raised her hand. Rome believes we will bow, she said. But Egypt has never bowed, not to gods, not to kings. The soldiers shouted her name until the sky trembled. Antony watched her, both proud and haunted. He knew Octavian's forces were vast. He knew defeat was possible, even likely. But as long as Cleopatra stood beside him, he would rather fall in love than live in fear. Together, they prepared for the final storm. Two souls against an empire. And when dawn broke, the Nile carried whispers of what was to come. For history had chosen its battlefield, and love had chosen its soldiers. The sea was restless that morning. Waves broke like the heartbeat of war. Cleopatra stood on the deck of her flagship, the wind tearing through her gold sails. Beside her, Mark Antony's fleet waited in silence. Rome had come, and so had destiny. Across the horizon, Octavian's armada rose like a storm. Hundreds of ships, disciplined and deadly. Trumpets sounded, shields clashed. The world held its breath. Antony's soldiers looked to the queen for courage. She gave it with her eyes, steady, unwavering. "Remember," she said, "we fight not for glory, but for the right to stand free." Her words carried across the water, a vow echoing over the waves. Then came the first strike. The sea exploded with fire and iron. Flaming arrows rained upon the ships. Smoke wrapped the sky in chaos. Antony's fleet charged forward, his voice thundering over the roar of war. Cleopatra's archers fired with deadly precision. The air trembled with screams and steel. The smell of salt and blood mixed with smoke. The horizon burned. Hour after hour, they fought. Two empires colliding beneath the sun. Antony's strength met Octavian's order. Courage against calculation. For a time, the queen's fleet held the line. Her ships cut through the waves like blades. She moved among her men, calm and fierce. Even in chaos, she was grace incarnate. But fate is cruel to those who burn too bright. The wind turned, and so did the tide. Octavian's ships encircled them, closing like jaws of iron. Antony shouted for reinforcements, but his captains hesitated, confused, afraid. Flames leapt between vessels. Masts cracked, sails collapsed. The sea became a graveyard of kings. Through the smoke, Cleopatra watched the horizon. Her fleet was faltering, the line collapsing. If she stayed, she would die with them. If she fled, she could save Egypt. Her heart waged war with her duty. Then came the decision no queen should face. She ordered her flagship to turn. Not out of fear, but strategy. The retreat would save what was left of her forces. But destiny misunderstood her courage. When Antony saw her sails moving away, his heart shattered. He thought she had betrayed him. That love had turned to flight. Grief consumed his reason. He abandoned command and followed her ship. Fleet, leaderless, fell apart. Octavian's forces seized the sea. By dusk, the battle was lost. The dream of their empire sank beneath the waves. Antony's ship reached hers before nightfall. He stormed aboard, his voice a storm of accusation. "You fled," he shouted. "You left me to die." Cleopatra stood silent, her face pale from smoke and sorrow. "I fled to save you," she whispered, "and Egypt." Their eyes locked. Fury, heartbreak, love. Then silence. Antony turned away, his rage melting into despair. He knew she was right, but pride was a wound that bled long. The queen laid her hand upon his shoulder. "Rome has won the sea," she said softly, "but not my spirit." So, he looked at her then, and saw not guilt, but grace. The woman who had risked everything to save him. Outside, the fires of Actium still burned. Inside, the last hope of resistance flickered faintly. They had lost a battle, not their bond, but both knew the end was coming. Octavian's armies would march for Egypt next. The world would call them doomed. Cleopatra did not fear doom, only surrender. Antony, broken yet loyal, swore he would fight to the last. Together, they sailed back to Alexandria. The stars dim above their silent fleet. The sea carried their defeat, but also their defiance. For even in ruin, their love remained unbroken. And as dawn rose over the blood-red waves, Cleopatra whispered to herself, "They can win the war, but not the legend." For legends, once born of fire, never drown. Alexandria stood quiet beneath a blood-red sky. The sea still carried the echo of Actium's defeat. In the palace, Cleopatra walked through silent halls, her crown heavy, her heart heavier. Mark Antony sat alone in the war room. His armor dented, his spirit cracked. He stared at maps littered with ashes of plans. Rome was coming, and there was no defense left. Octavian's legions advanced across the desert. Each day brought a new message of surrender. But Cleopatra refused to kneel. She would face the storm with dignity. She sent envoys with gifts, offering peace in words gilded with pride. Octavian's reply was cold: submit and live, resist and vanish. The queen tore the letter in silence. "I will vanish on my own terms," she said. Her servants bowed low, for they knew the weight of that promise. Antony, once the Lion of Rome, now roared only at ghosts. He wandered the halls restless, haunted by regret and memory. Cleopatra watched him from afar. He was no longer her general. He was her grief. But even in his ruin, she loved him, because he had given her loyalty when the world gave her war. One evening, he entered her chamber unannounced. His eyes burned with a strange peace. "Octavian is at the gates," he said. "We cannot win." Cleopatra stood still, her voice steady. "Then we will not beg." He smiled faintly. "You still speak like a goddess." "And you," she said softly, "still fight like a man who believes." They said no more. There was nothing left to plan, only to endure. That night, Octavian's army breached the harbor. The city trembled beneath the thunder of war. Fires painted the sky in orange and smoke. The palace shook like a dying heart. Antony rallied his few remaining men. Charging through the streets with fearless rage, he fought not for victory, but for memory. Each strike a farewell, each wound a confession of love. But courage cannot conquer numbers. By dawn, his legions had fallen. He returned to the palace, bloodied, broken, unrecognizable. Servants whispered that Cleopatra was dead. The rumor tore through him like a blade. He dropped his sword and whispered, "Then let me follow her," before anyone could stop him. He fell on his own blade. The sound echoed through marble halls, the final cry of Rome's bravest son, as his lifeblood stained the floor. A messenger rushed in, shouting, "Wait, the queen still lives." Antony gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Alive," he whispered. They lifted him gently, carrying him through corridors of smoke and tears. Cleopatra waited in her hidden chamber, her face pale as the dawn. When she saw him, she broke, not as a queen, but as a woman. He reached for her hand, trembling. "I thought you were gone." "I am still here," she whispered, "but not for long." He tried to speak, but words failed. His strength faded like the setting sun. She held him close, her tears falling onto his armor. "Forgive me," he murmured, "for losing everything." She shook her head, pressing her forehead to his. "You lost nothing that mattered." The air grew still. Only their breathing filled the room. Antony's hand slid from hers. His eyes closed, peaceful at last. Cleopatra's cry shattered the silence. It was the sound of love dying, and history taking its place. Outside, Octavian's banners rose above the city. The empire had conquered the queen's world, but not her will. She knelt beside Antony's body, whispering words the gods alone would hear. "Your fight is done. Mine remains." Then she stood, her tears drying into resolve. If fate had chosen her end, she would choose its form. The Queen of Egypt would not be paraded in chains. She would end her story as she had lived it, proud. And as night fell over Alexandria, the torches flickered like dying stars. The love of two empires had turned to dust. But the legend was just beginning. The city of Alexandria slept beneath the shadow of conquest. Rome's banners fluttered where Egypt's glory once stood. In her chamber, Cleopatra sat before a mirror, her crown beside her, untouched. The queen who had faced empires now faced herself. Her reflection was calm, her eyes infinite. Mark Antony was gone, his sword silent, his promise eternal. She had buried him with honor, wrapped in gold and myrrh, beneath the rising sun. No priest's prayer could match her silence. It was grief and devotion in one breath. Outside, Octavian's soldiers guarded the palace gates. Their orders were clear: keep her alive. Alive to be paraded through Rome. Alive to humiliate her once more. But Cleopatra had lived her life on her own terms. She would not end it in chains. She rose, her movements graceful as ritual. Every gesture deliberate, every breath measured. She dressed in white linen, the color of both purity and death. Her attendants, Iris and Charmian, watched in silence, tears glistening in their eyes. Cleopatra turned to them gently. "Do not mourn me yet," she said. "This is not an ending. It is a choice." Outside, the wind carried the sounds of soldiers and whispers. The conqueror, Octavian, awaited his trophy. But Cleopatra would give him nothing. No tears, no submission. She called for her treasures: jewels, perfumes, and scrolls of wisdom. "Let the world remember Egypt not for its fall," she said, "but for its beauty, its courage, its soul." Her servants obeyed, decorating the chamber as if for a coronation. Incense filled the air, its smoke curling like ancient prayers. Cleopatra sat upon her golden throne, her posture perfect, her spirit unbroken. She whispered a final letter to her son, Caesarion. "Rule with mercy, She wrote, "For cruelty dies, but love endures." Her voice trembled only once, not from fear, but from love unspoken. Then she asked softly, "Where is the basket?" Iris brought it forth, a woven vessel of figs covered with silk. Beneath the fruit, a secret moved, a coiled asp, silent and sacred. The snake, symbol of Isis, of power, of rebirth. The goddess's final gift to her queen. Cleopatra smiled faintly. "The gods have kept their promise," she murmured. She dismissed the guards outside with a word. No one dared question the queen's last command. When the door closed, she turned to her loyal women. "You have served me with devotion," she said. "Now serve Egypt with remembrance." Iris knelt, unable to speak. Charmian bowed low, whispering, "You will live forever." Cleopatra touched their hands. Her gaze filled with warmth and resolve. "I will live," she said, "but not in flesh, in fire." She reached into the basket, lifting the serpent with serene grace. Its scales shimmered like bronze in the candlelight. Her eyes met its gaze, life greeting death. Without hesitation, she placed it upon her arm. The asp struck swiftly, its venom flowing like fate itself. A sharp breath escaped her lips. Then calm, the poison burned. But her face remained peaceful, almost radiant. She reclined on her throne, her head tilting toward the heavens. Around her, the incense thickened, filling the air with the scent of eternity. Iris collapsed beside her. Charmian adjusted the queen's crown one last time. When Octavian entered moments later, he stopped in awe. There she lay, still, regal, untouched by fear or defeat. The asp curled at her feet like a guardian, her beauty undimmed, her dignity absolute. For the first time, the conqueror bowed his head. Even Rome had to respect such courage. He whispered, "She robbed me of victory." And he was right. Cleopatra had denied him the triumph he sought. She had turned her death into her final act of sovereignty. Her reign ended not with surrender, but with silence more powerful than war. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds. The Nile glimmered, endless and alive. Her people mourned, but they also remembered. They whispered her name as prayer, as defiance, as hope. Cleopatra, the queen who chose her destiny. The woman who ruled hearts as she ruled empires. In death, she became eternal. A symbol not of loss, but of freedom. For she had taught the world that a woman could hold her own fate, even when empires tried to take it. And though her crown rested still, her spirit soared beyond it. The last queen of Egypt was gone. But her fire, her undying, fearless fire, had just begun to rise. The palace was silent. Only the wind moved through the empty halls. Cleopatra was gone, but her presence lingered. Every corner, every torch still whispered her name. Octavian ordered her burial beside Mark Antony. Even he could not deny their bond. Two souls who defied empires, now sleeping side by side in eternity. Outside, Alexandria mourned. The city that once sang of victory now wept for its queen. Women left flowers by the river. Men bowed their heads as the bells tolled. The queen was dead, but Egypt was not broken. Her spirit flowed through the Nile, unseen but eternal. Her people spoke softly of her courage, how she faced death like a goddess, not a prisoner. Children recited her name as legend. Scribes recorded her words as prophecy. And though Rome ruled Egypt now, no Roman could rule her memory. Octavian returned to Rome with his triumph hollow. He had conquered a kingdom, but lost a story he could never own. He tried to erase her, to turn her into a warning instead of a wonder. But history has never listened to conquerors. It remembers those who dared. Cleopatra's legacy outlived his empire. Statues, songs, and scrolls carried her image across centuries. Painters called her beauty divine. Philosophers called her wisdom rare. But those who understood her most spoke of her strength, the kind that never bowed. She was not perfection. She was power made human. She loved boldly, ruled fiercely, and met her fate with open eyes. Empires rose and fell, but her story refused to die. For every woman told she could not lead, Cleopatra whispered, "Yes, you can." For every soul afraid to stand alone, she became their mirror of courage. Her name crossed borders and tongues, becoming a symbol of what will never be conquered. Artists carved her face in marble and memory. Poets wrote of her fire, her grace, her defiance. The Romans called her dangerous. The world called her unforgettable, because she had lived not for safety, but for meaning. And meaning never dies. Centuries later, historians still argued her truth. Was she cruel? Was she cunning? The answer was simple. She was real. As flawed and fearless as any who dream of greatness. Her story outshone the myths that sought to replace it. Her voice still echoed through time, soft, proud, alive. And Egypt, her beloved land, remembered her not as its last ruler, but as its greatest one. By the river where she once stood, the reeds still swayed to an ancient rhythm. The wind still carried her promise. Empires fall, but hearts that burn never fade. Every queen who rose after her carried a spark of her flame. Every leader who stood against the world felt her strength within. For Cleopatra was more than a name. She was a message. That no crown defines you. That no defeat erases you. She was proof that power wears many faces. Some crowned, some scarred, all eternal. And though Rome thought it had written her final chapter, she became the author of her own immortality. In the book of time, her page still glows, a lesson in courage, in purpose, in the cost of greatness. Cleopatra, the queen who refused to kneel, the queen who ruled her own ending. And though her body turned to dust, her fire still lights the hearts of dreamers. For the world forgot many kings, but it never forgot her. Because legends, true legends, never die. Centuries have passed, but her flame still burns. Cleopatra, queen, lover, warrior, dreamer, the woman who defied an empire and became eternity. Her story is not about crowns or conquest. It's about power, the power to choose your own fate. When the world demanded her surrender, she chose dignity. When men wrote her as temptation, she rewrote herself as legacy. She proved that courage is louder than fear, and that strength can wear a woman's face. Her name became a symbol whispered through time, not of tragedy, but of triumph. Because true greatness is not in how long you reign, but how deeply you inspire. Cleopatra's reign ended, but her spirit never did. Every woman who stands unafraid, every dreamer who refuses to bow, every soul who dares to rise again, carries her fire. So let her story remind you, your pain does not define you. Your strength does. Your will does. Like Cleopatra, you were born for moments the world will never forget. When everything seems lost, remember, the flame still lives inside you. You are not small. You are not powerless. You are the storm the world never expected. And if her courage touched you today, let your voice be heard. Share her story. Write your own. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you felt. Because every story grows stronger when shared. And if her fire moved your heart, subscribe so we can keep it burning. For this is more than English. This is strength, rebirth, and destiny, the fire of legends, the fire that never dies.